holding space in the ESL classroom. This is something that is vital for ESL teaching. If you want to have the confidence, feel that you know what you're doing, and that you're really adding value to the learners and helping them to progress. Now, all teachers, when they first start out, are nervous, they have anxiety about, like students viewing them, sometimes how they look, how they stand. Um, all these types of things will come into play when you walk into a classroom. And, in training teachers over the years, I've had so many things happen that you wouldn't, expect. Like sometimes in assessing teachers, I actually had one teacher faint in the classroom at the board, and I actually had to slide across the floor and grab this poor woman before she actually hit the floor. And things like that. I mean, people nerves are very real, and they can have a huge impact. So you've done a TESOL course, or you're doing a TESOL course, and you're so excited for what you're going to do in teaching English as a second language and your new career, only to then get to the point of the classroom and suddenly freeze up and go, I'm worried, what if I get in the classroom? What if I stumble? What if I say the wrong thing? What if I make a mistake? What if I misspell something on the board and the students point it out? There's so many what ifs that contribute to this anxiety that teachers, particularly new teachers, feel. And this makes it very hard for some teachers to put themselves out there, basically, and stand up and say, hey, I'm going to teach you, only to have the learners, particularly if you're teaching adults, looking back at you and it makes you feel like, it doesn't mean it's real, but it makes you feel like, oh my goodness, I'm not doing a good job, or I'm a fraud, or I don't really know what I'm doing, and I've read all about it, but I'm not experienced. And all these things can start to play on your mind and make you think. And I mean, it can get to the best of us. I remember the first time I was teaching a TESOL course, and I started to get anxiety because I hadn't taught officially a TESOL course before, and there was about 30 people in the room, and all of a sudden I started to hyperventilate, and I was like speaking like this, with a hitch in my breath, and I'm like, oh my goodness. And I'm actually having a mental dialogue with myself going, get a hold of yourself, what are you doing? Don't be stupid. This isn't about you, this is about them and what they need, the students. And so I actually had to take a beat, take a second, take a deep breath in, deep breath out. And I mean, everyone was looking at me, and I just had to just stop for a second and then, tell myself off. And then I just started again. I looked at the learners and I thought, what do these people need? I'm here to supply what they need. I've got to be focusing on that. And as soon as I started focusing on the learners and what they needed, and didn't think about myself, how I was feeling, if I looked like I was shaking, all those things, I was irrelevant. I melted away, and it was just the learners and what I was, conveying to them. And at that point, everything just calmed and slowed right down, and I was able to hold space because I knew beyond a doubt what I had, the information. I knew they needed it, and I knew the relevance of it, and that this was going to be important for them. So I just focused on that, what I knew they needed, and how I knew to deliver that. And this is what holding space is. Now, there are many different references to holding space that you can find online, but I'm referring to that position of being able to stand in complete confidence and authority in the classroom and teach without worrying about how you appear, how you sound, those anxious, nervous feelings. You're able to just stand there in your own space because you know what you're doing and why and how it's a benefit. So this holding space is incredibly important because it will also enhance all of the learning that takes place in the classroom. So I've had many instances, where I've observed teachers with nerves, and I mean, I've even had nerves myself, just things going on in my life, and I've walked into a classroom not feeling 100% prepared, And I've had to take a deep breath and just bring myself back in alignment with holding space and be able to teach from that place. Now, with the ESL classroom, when you're holding space, it comes down to a number of things. But, basically, what we're talking about is straight away, you understand the learner's needs. So this is where it starts. So if you're teaching children, there's always that element you have to motivate them. You have to have, it has to be fun. It has to have energy. So just keep that in mind. If you're teaching adults in the ESL classroom, it's a completely different thing. So here, the learner's needs come down to why are they there in the first place learning English? All of them will have that common goal, whether it's to find a job in an English speaking country, or if you're overseas, if it's to get a better job or get a promotion, is it so they can go into further studies in English? All of these things. Are they wanting to travel? Are they wanting to integrate into an English speaking society? So these common goals that they have, this is what you need to keep foremost no matter what you teach. You have to think about how to engage your students from the perspective of where they're coming from. So that means that no matter what course book or what materials you're teaching, you have to look at it from those perspectives. You have to think, right, so this activity's got students answering questions, but how can I connect that to their life goals, to their learning goals? So how can I connect that to travel? How can I connect that to a job scenario or a further study in English scenario? And and automatically you'll get good at this as you practice it. And so that will give you confidence that whatever you're teaching, students aren't going to go, oh, I don't want to learn that. No, because you understand and you convey to them, look, today I'm going to be teaching this. This is what you're learning, but this is why. And this is how you're going to be able to use that immediately in real life. And I've spoken about this particular example before, but I was teaching upper intermediate class once on the Gold Coast, and the lesson was about cooking paella. And I mean, the students didn't give a crap about cooking paella. They weren't interested in cooking. I mean, ESL students basically, when they're in a foreign country, live on ramen. So, the noodles, that's it. So the poor things. And so, I was like, they don't want to cook paella, and this is crazy. So I had to immediately do my job, which was think about how am I going to connect that to these young adults in the ESL classroom. So I went into the classroom and, I said to the class, we're going to talk today about one of your life goals. And so let's go over them. And we discussed, got a list on the board of what their life goals are. And one of the big ones was, of course, getting a job in an English-speaking country. What kind of jobs can you get? And then mostly that's hospitality or cleaning. So I said today we're going to deal with that. And then also another one of the main goals was, of all things, dating and meeting, the opposite sex in, social situations and how to deal with that. So I'm like, all right, let's talk about how to talk in a social setting. So we looked at that. So then I did a role play with one of our confident students, and I brought him up, and I said to him, just pretend, you're meeting me in a party or at a bar, and you approach me, you want to chat. And so he comes up, he swaggers up, and he's like, oh, hi. And I'm like, hello. And then we started to converse, and I just said to him, oh, where are you from? And he said his country. I said, oh, tell me about one of the dishes, your favorite dish from your country. So then he started to go on about, this dish. And I said, oh, how do you cook it? Can you cook it? He goes, oh, yes, yes. And he started to explain, oh, you smash this vegetable and you crush this. And then, you've got to put it into little pieces. And I'm like, oh, stop. And he's like, why? And I'm saying, oh, this is not attractive at all. And he's like, well, what do you mean? And I said, because you can't speak to me properly. You're saying smash this and put this, and that's not how you speak about cooking. And I said, and if this were a job interview, I wouldn't feel that you could work in a kitchen or talk to customers about an order for food because you don't know what you're saying. And he's like, oh my God. He goes, what do I do? I said, you need to learn the proper, precise vocabulary and terminology. And he's like, well, I want to learn. Suddenly the whole class wanted to learn. So no longer was this a lesson about cooking a recipe they couldn't give a damn about. Now this was a lesson that was going to give them the ability to meet and talk to people, and also, talk in a job situation so they could get work and continue and keep work. And it was very relevant to them. So being able to hold space in the ESL classroom partially is about the learner needs. It's very important to understand their needs. So I understood clearly what my learners' needs were, and I made them go over those learner needs so they connected back with it. Like, okay, these are my needs. I do want this. And then the material for the day, okay, this recipe, suddenly this was going to fulfill two learner needs that were very important and high on the list. Whereas if I'd just gone in and taught it, it was just about cooking a recipe they were never going to do in their lives, probably. So it changed the whole perspective of the lesson. That's part of what holding space is the perception of your students in that classroom about what they're doing there and why. And it's your job to steer that. So from that point forward, understanding these learner goals and being confident that now my students were going to be engaged in that lesson. That helped me hold space. I could stand up and I could confidently teach those students because now I knew they were fully connected with what was going on and it met their goals and they knew that. Now, another thing with holding space is the learning materials. So, you need to really feel confident that you understand what you're teaching and you know how to present it. So you don't want to rush into, activities and burn through materials. That's one of the things that, new teachers particularly have to learn not to do. So, just introducing your tasks well and, it might be just adding a few questions. I remember doing a lesson on safety and directions and following maps or signs and things like this. So we talked about the different signs that you see in and around the place when you travel. So we connected it to travel and we connected it to safety, learner goals. If you're over in your foreign country, you need to understand. And then we just talked about, well, this was on the Gold Coast, so we talked about signs that you see at the beach. And, students had seen different signs. And then we talked about, shark safety and beach safety because of rips and things like this. And then I put some questions up on the board, like, for them to guess how many shark attacks there are in Australia annually, how many people die of drowning and, what happens in a rip and all of this. And by the time they, like, been in pairs and they discussed it and then we came back and this had taken 5 to 10 minutes and then I gave them the actual statistics. They were shocked and they were like, oh my god. And then I told them about someone that I personally knew that had been attacked by a shark that they'd survived and what that was like, and they were like, oh my god. And then we talked about near drownings and things like that. So by this point the students were well and truly engaged and really interested in the learning materials because I was introducing them in that way. So you understanding the materials, thinking before each task, how can you make that task interesting, introduce it in a way that will pique their interest and also connect back to their learner needs so that, again, these learners are engaged. If your focus is on doing this and you do this well, you are automatically holding space in that classroom because you're teaching from a position of authority. Now, I'm not talking about authority, I'm the teacher, you're the student. That's ridiculous. What I'm talking about is the authority of understanding intrinsically that you are providing exactly what they need. And the students feel that because, when you know what you're doing really well in these instances, it comes off because you'll be passionate about it and enthusiastic because, you're trying to make that connection, you're showing them, and you've got that zeal basically in your voice, and they hear that and they're like, yes, that's the authority, so this is holding space. Now, another thing is to connect with the learners in the instance where you're observing them well. And this is another area of holding space. So you're observing the class while you're teaching it. You can see if students start kicking the chair legs or swinging on chairs, and adults do that. I have taught classes where I've had adult students swinging on the back of chairs, and one guy, he was quite a muscular dude. He broke 3 chairs in one lesson, despite me telling him constantly not to do it. So we actually had to take it away from him and give him a completely different chair because, this was crazy. And just like, you have to stop, swinging on the chair. But this was just his nervous tick. But being aware of what he was doing, and I had to keep him, changing seats, like different peer group work, keep this guy was one of those people that just needed to be moving. They learnt by moving. So you need to keep people like that quite engaged constantly so that they're not just, left to their own devices. Another thing that happened to me once, I was teaching, and it was a boardroom style classroom. So on my left, I had one female student, and on my right, I had another. And they had this nervous tick where they would bump their or jostle their leg up and down underneath the table. But unfortunately, the table wasn't very tall. So the table, as you can imagine, was just bopping up and down constantly. And I was like, it was really driving me to distraction. And I had to put my hands on the table and say, okay, guys, right, we're going to, switch you guys around, and I had to move them into, the lesson task wasn't pair and group work, but I had to adapt it and move these women around, get them paired with different people, get the class up and walking around, and doing like a discussion, like a biography exchange, just to keep things moving because, again, I needed those observation skills to be able to hold space in the classroom. Otherwise, it would have been distracting for everyone. And then it's like, as a teacher, you're not able to control that classroom well because there are distractions that aren't being dealt with. So when you know how to deal with these distractions and you do it, you're holding that space again. And again, it's not an authority. You stop doing that. You get up and do this, or you get into pairs. It's not that. It's just the case that you understand, you observe, you notice, you see what needs to be done, you know what to do, and you do it. And that knowing that, having that knowledge will give you that confidence to hold that space again in that classroom environment. You know how to keep that going. And that's what holding that space is. It's not just about you personally, it's about the whole space of the room, that you're able to hold that and keep that as an organic, positive environment. Another thing that you will need, to develop is a keen interest in your students. Now, I'm not talking about their personal lives and getting all involved and up in their business. I'm not talking about that at all. But what I am talking about is building rapport, and that cannot be underestimated. Let them get to know you as well. Like, let them know things about your life. I mean, you don't have to get nitty gritty or anything like that, but they need to feel they understand you and where you're coming from, because you don't want to teach from a place of ego where it's like, oh, I'm a teacher, this is my career, this is where I'm coming from. No. So, you're a fellow human being who loves to make connections with other people, who loves to help people, who can provide a service of value, and you care and want to do that. And when they feel this coming from you, they will sit back and trust you, and they will put themselves in your hands, because remember, they're taking a leap of faith every time they try to answer when they don't really know if they're making a mistake. They're putting themselves on the line because they feel like they're embarrassing themselves when they can't do things right. They're adults, but they get things wrong. No one likes to look silly. But if they understand that, you have strong empathetic skills, and that you have a keen interest in their betterment, they will put themselves in your hands willingly. And this is where you're able to really help students to progress. So, being patient with them as well, and conveying that strong sense of understanding and passion for the students' progress, and their success. This will come across in the classroom. Now, And this goes on to having those strong empathetic skills, having those common learning opportunities before all students. You can use comparisons, you can show the difference and similarities between students, between yourself and students, people and nationalities, bringing some cultural awareness, but also, just being empathetic to their needs. Like sometimes there are things going on in students' lives and they may or may not want to discuss it in the classroom. So being empathetic of that, knowing when to back off, knowing when to lead and allow students to discuss certain things. Like I remember once I was teaching in Korea and a student who was always perfectly punctual. He was a businessman. He came late to class, like nearly 20 minutes. And I did allow him to come in. And because at that point, you're supposed to you sort of say, well, you've sort of forfeited this class, but I didn't. But he looked really shook up, which was very unusual for him. So, I just said to him, oh, are you okay? And the whole class was concerned, obviously. And I said, would you like to talk about this? And so I just sort of like paused the class and he just went on to tell us how he just witnessed a horrific accident on the road, where he drives, near where he lives. There's this really steep hill, but the other side is a really steep drop. And some youths in a car went flying over the hill. And he knew at the bottom of the drop, at the bottom of the hill, there was a set of lights and a huge intersection. And he just knew the minute they got over that hill, they were going to hit that intersection and cause a huge crash. And he heard the crash, went to the top of the hill, drove up as he was driving up, and he just saw the whole thing in front of him. And it was just horrific, he said, and that's why he was late. So then we actually shifted the class focus and we started talking about road and safety and driving. And, students talked about their personal experiences. And, we had so much communication, listening and speaking opportunities in that class. And the students, none of them could have gone back to the lesson topic at this point. But we didn't need to because we had another organic situation going on, which was a learning opportunity and a communication opportunity, which was more important. So having those really good empathetic and then interpersonal skills, and this is the next one, where you allow or you actually encourage all the learners to develop a connection with each other and their common learning goals so that they all have an understanding that they're contributing to each other's success. And this is spoken about also in transformational leadership in teaching. It's a really important thing. So students realize that they have a role to play in the success of not just their own learning, but in the learning of others in the classroom, so they can bring their rich experience, life experience, and knowledge into the classroom, and this can all become learning opportunities. So this is really important. You can use a lot of things like pair and group work, projects and games, and connect people that way. So we're moving on to the next area, which is the ability to connect people. For a teacher to hold space in the class, you do need to be able to look for connections and encourage students to connect with each other. And you need to be constantly vigilant in watching for students' individual strengths and weaknesses, pairing them with students who will match them and fill that gap. So students who are strong with grammar match with students who are strong with perhaps the speaking skill or vocabulary, and so that the grammar students will help those students that might be weaker in grammar, and allowing students to help in each other's learning progress is very important. And then the classroom becomes an organic thing. So perhaps you might ask a grammar question and a student tries to answer and makes a mistake. You don't have to answer that yourself. You can refer to a student who's good to grammar and say, oh, so and so, could you please explain this for the class or for this student, because you have a great way of explaining that. And then that gives that student confidence, and that student can then answer the question. You don't have to answer everything. You've got students there with knowledge. Use that particularly if you're teaching adults or young adults. And so, again, you're able to hold space in the classroom because you're facilitating learning. You're not setting yourself up to make mistakes out of nervousness or anything else. You're there keeping that organic environment, learning environment going and feeding into it. So connecting people, looking for those connections. And another really important thing with the interpersonal skills, which I missed, was developing a strong sense of community in the classroom, training your students to help each other to achieve goals and be invested in each other's learning goals. So, having a class as a community is really important. And this is another thing. I remember having a huge argument with my husband one morning before I went to work, and I really did not want to go to work, but I had to. So I went to class and, I walked in, I was in the foulest moods, I was feral. And the students just took one look at me and they were like, teacher, what is wrong? Oh my goodness, because I had a lot of Brazilians in the class. And I'm like, oh, I had this argument, this fight with my husband. And they're, oh, what was it about? And I'm like, okay. So I kind of like, kept it bullet point, but, he wanted this and I wanted that and blah, blah, blah. And so they're analyzing the argument and they're like, oh, but what about this? What about that? And, oh, how could he do this? And how could he say that? And I'm like, yeah, this happens. And we had a big discussion. I mean, we talked about arguments and we talked about relationships and they gave examples of when they'd had similar things happening in their lives with family or members or partners. And we had a really great discussion for over half an hour. I taught the rest of the class that day and I had a great day, wonderful time with my students. I went home in a brilliantly good mood, cooked dinner. My husband came home and I'm all friendly and cheerful. How was your day, blah? And he just stood and looked at me because he knew I was livid before I'd gone to work. And all of a sudden, I was in this great mood. He's like, uh-oh, what's going on? And I'm like, oh my God, I forgot I was so angry with you. And I just started laughing and he started laughing too. But that was so wonderful because having that, interpersonal relationships build with my students and receiving back that empathy from them, and we had the discussion, you can see it's a positive influence on everyone's life, and it's certainly a positive influence in learning. So another area just to look at for holding space is a high level of motivational skills. You really need to work on these. Develop these skills. Use positive reinforcement in class with your students by being encouraging, using praise, not ridiculous praise, but praise where praise is due. Teach your students to compliment each other and encourage each other. You don't have to control everything that goes on in that class. You facilitate what goes on in that class and guide and steer it, but you don't control it. And when you try to control, that's where you set yourself up for failure. So, encouraging learners to encourage each other, keeping the learning goal in front of all of the students, and also letting them know how every day they are working towards it, reminding them of what they're achieving and how well they're doing, and looking for ways to celebrate success. These are all really important things in the ESL classroom, and once you're focused on these things, these right things in the classroom, your role as a teacher will shift and you won't need to worry about your nerves. You've got more important things that you're focused on. You're focused on the students' connections, your connection with the students. You're focused on observing your class and what's happening and what they are needing in any given moment. So, you're watching their body language, you're watching if somebody needs to be switched around, you're watching if a task isn't going so well and you need to get your students physically moving, or you need to, complete that task quickly and move on to another one, or something's too difficult, you need to adjust it. You're focused on all of these things, and suddenly you're not relevant anymore, which is brilliant because then you're not worried about how you look, how you sound, you're not getting anxious. And, if you write, I've written words wrongly on the board before and had a student point them out and go, teacher, is that spelt right? And I'm like, oh my goodness, it's not. Okay, here, come up and can you please correct that for the class? And they'll come up and they'll do, and it doesn't bother you at all because it's all part of the learning goal. So, and if they're like, oh, I don't know how to do it, get the dictionary and do it. Anyone can make mistakes. I'm up here writing quickly, so I can just accidentally. And since computers, who doesn't make spelling errors these days when you're writing on a board? So just to be aware of the right focus, will enable you to go in front of the ESL classroom, totally focused on the benefit of the learners and not on yourself. And in this way, you will hold space. And it's like the sweet spot when you hit the tennis ball with the tennis racket. You've hit that sweet spot. You will hit that sweet spot in your classroom, and it will be a living, organic learning environment. And you will love teaching English as a second language, because everyone, you can feel the learning happening, and you can feel all of those connections between the students and the learning, and the progress that's taking place.